Okay, welcome to this Sunday afternoon. It's Matthew Maloney on Northern Vibe. This is our first Northern Vibe. I must say I'm very excited for that reason, and of course because I've got an excellent guest with me today. Just to give the briefest of backgrounds about myself, my name is Matthew Maloney. I'm a Cairns resident. I'm really interested in a number of things. I'm interested in forming a new state for North Queensland. I have a great love of music and literature. This is something that's God willing, will be in our program a little bit later on. In the show as it develops a little bit later on, I should say, as it evolves. And today I'm going to speak to the president of Boot Brisbane. Bill Bates is a very, very interesting man. I'm going to get him to do the fundamental introductions. After I introduce him, I'm going to get him to explain who he is, his professional background in the RAAF, and how he came to be interested in this very interesting subject. Bill, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Matt. It's a pleasure to be with you. My background is I was born in Western Australia and joined the Air Force when I was 15 as an apprentice and served 24 years in the Defence Force, roaming around Australia and overseas. I came to Cairns in about 2006, just initially on a visit, and came up on holidays regularly and moved here in 2012. Being in retirement, had plenty of time to sort of read newspapers and listen to the radio talkback shows, and the common thread to everyday conversation was Brisbane's not looking after us, or things are not going well for us and we need to do something. So that twigged my interest. And then in 2017, the most notable event was the redistribution of electoral boundaries in Queensland. And basically that created a situation where we put another 4 representatives in the Queensland Parliament, bringing it up from 89 to 93. And the 4 additional representatives were all in southeast Queensland. So now we had a situation where representation of central North Queensland was now only 17 seats of the 93-seat parliament, which is a diminishing percentage. Because if you go back to when it was first created as a 89-seat parliament, central North Queensland actually had 24 seats in an 89-seat parliament, and that was in 1986. So we've gone from about 27% of the representation in Brisbane down to about 17 or 18%. And with Brisbane continually marching on at a great rate in population growth, at least twice as fast as central and North Queensland, we're faced with redistributions in the future where they'll continue to get additional seats, and we'll find it very difficult to maintain our 17 seats. So the outlook for the future is a diminishing representation in the Brisbane Parliament, something we really can't tolerate for too much longer, simply because we will never have an impact to address the issues that we need addressing in our regions.
Okay, well, thanks very much. That's an excellent overview. Look, would it be accurate to say, to kind of round off that little bit of the conversation, that it's to use an example from physics, that it's kind of like a black hole, something that grows with the eating? So we have what could perhaps accurately, well, would you agree that it could accurately be described as a critical mass of electorates in the southeast corner? And really, all elections are won and lost in the southeast corner, and the regions are pretty much incidental. That's the way I understood what you just explained to me. Is that correct?
Well, not really, because it depends on how close the elections are from one party to the other. I mean, we've got a situation where most elections are only won by, other than the Newman election in 2012, which was a landslide, most elections are only won by maybe 5, 6, 7 seats. Mm-hmm. And for the last we've had probably 4 hung parliaments in the last 20 years. So we still count, and that's what we need to count, but we need to get ourselves in a position where that balance of power is in the hands of North Queensland representatives, and those representatives initiate the process for a separate state. But what the problem is the policy settings. The parties would both have problems in regards to coming up with policies that are universal enough to look after the best interests of the people in Southeast Queensland and their needs, and at the same time look after the interests of the people in Central and North Queensland and their needs and aspirations. So you've got to both parties, well, all parties have got a great problem in they've got to win those 73 seats, in as many as those 73 seats as they can in Central and in Southeast Queensland, and to do that, they may have to write policies that may, to a degree or sometimes substantially, impact adversely on the people of Central and North Queensland. So that's one of the dilemmas of such a vast state and the disproportionate spread of the population. Both parties have to win a good portion of those 73 seats down there, and then hopefully pick up enough in the regions to get them over the line. So that's the critical problem. You just such a diverse state and needs. It's very hard to come up with policies in the best interests of the whole 5 million people in Queensland.
Okay, so again, because obviously we're targeting this recording and this broadcast at people who perhaps might not be as familiar with this topic as you are, and I must say increasingly I'm becoming. So fundamentally, the issue is if you have all these electorates in the southeast corner and you have, as you accurately described, a diverse and enormous state, policy is going to be more towards keeping the electorates in the south, keeping the critical mass of electorates in the southeast corner happy, and thereby ignoring the wishes, the concerns, and the aspirations of people in the regional areas. Is that a more accurate way of putting it?
That's right, and you especially see this in the agricultural sector, the fisheries sector, and the mining sector. There's a lot of pressure on those sectors as far as environmental controls, and to the extent that sometimes the judgment of the Southeast Queensland government can't come to terms with the needs and aspirations of people up here. We've had things like the Vegetation Management Act, and now we've got the Reef Act in regards to runoff and that they're coming up with legislation to satisfy the environmental lobby, and much of that's to the detriment of the regional agriculture section and the fishers, and it's treating those people who get their livelihoods off the land as though they don't know what they're doing and that they're destroyers of the land, rather than the people who actually have a vested interest in ensuring the land generates wealth for them and continues to do so well into the future. So that's the difference in the mindset.
Yeah, look, and obviously when you get a spread of geography and a spread of population over such a large area, you're always going to get these issues with I suppose the best way of articulating it would be to say diffusing ideas, diffusing identity. To my mind, another example would perhaps be the indigenous issue. That is to say, all Indigenous people, like Indigenous people in the southeast corner, have a very different life experience and worldview to ones here in North Queensland, and perhaps a different identity too. What would you say to that?
Well, I think Indigenous people, we've got to look at the fact that there were several hundred groups of Indigenous people throughout Australia, and they're not all necessarily have things completely in common, and they have different aspirations as well. So we need to be aware of that. I mean, the people in the Cape and in the communities have a vastly different view of life and difficulties compared to Indigenous people who have had a long association living in the communities in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. So there are different situations that need to be addressed, and it's time really to probably more localise the issues and resolve them on a local basis rather than trying to fix it from a broad brush, especially academic-wise, from places like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane.
Yeah, and you know, look, this rural-urban divide is something that obviously does cover, you know, racial boundaries, I suppose, and I don't even like to really use the word boundaries. But you know, that's people in regional and rural Queensland do have a separate identity, and with this, if I can make the observation, strange push for identity politics, it's something that I think is a bit of a distortion, because living here in North Queensland, you know, a lot of my neighbours are very multi-ethnic. Like, I've got Korean people living here, we've got Indigenous people living quite close by, and the people that I associate with socially and in other sporting and religious organisations, we got a very, very wide spread of people at one of the organisations I'm part of. It has Filipinos, it has Congolese people, it has Nigerian people, it has people from other parts of Africa, it has people from Goa in India, it has what I suppose you describe as, you know, your traditional Caucasian Anglo-Celtic Australians, Anglo-Celtic Australians, and other kind of people from Britain. It has a lot of people from continental Europe, French, and all that sort of stuff. And there's a distinction, obviously, even in between, you know, I suppose, and I really don't like talking about things around racial lines, but around, you know, your Western Caucasians, it's not as if we're all the same. It's not as if we have this singular worldview. What we are united by is by geography, and that's something that we've kind of all chosen, especially people who've emigrated to this area. And I hold a lot more in common with an Indigenous person from North Queensland than I do an urban sophisticate from, say, the West End in Brisbane, or someone who lives in the Rocks in Sydney. And I don't mean that in a dismissive or disrespectful way. It's purely an observation that you know, culture grows in areas. It's something that transcends race. And I'd be interested, you know, and I think that that's something that's really going to impact on the dynamic a lot, because there has been a real focus on identity. We live in times where identity is just now such a massive focus. And I don't see it as a sustainable argument, because ideas cross racial bounds and because common issues cross that. So I think that's going to be one of the great strengths of the North Queensland movement. I believe it is going to be truly diverse in ideas, and it's obviously going to have, a lot of Indigenous people involved.
Well, it really boils down to being able to make your decisions yourself and you know, in the greater community. So what we're looking at is, rather than the decisions being made in Brisbane, we as a community of Central and North Queensland get together, form our own state, vote for our own representatives in our own parliament who make decisions in our best interest. And we judge them every election, and we decide whether they stay or go and get replaced. So that's the real critical thing. We will determine our own future, and we'll determine what we need, rather than it being determined down in Brisbane and overwhelmed by the influence of the 73 members of Parliament in Brisbane. So that's the key. It's about representing us and all our diverse people here in our regions and getting the best outcomes for them so that they can continue to live here, prosper, have opportunities, and next generations also have greater opportunities for prosperity.
Yeah, it's really funny that sovereignty seems to be accepted for racial categories, which again is kind of really not realistic when it's not as if Indigenous people, to use that specific example, are this homogenous group of people that are the same everywhere, have the same worldviews, vote the same ways, think the same ways, worship the same ways, eat the same foods. But it's simply just not the case. We know from looking at the political history of not just the Western world, but even in places like Asia and Africa, that issues are what unites people more than blood, more than even soil and geography, of course. But issues tend to be local, so you have this strange circular loop where, because people are living in a specific area, they're dealing with the same issues. They tend to they talk together, and they tend to come up with the best results for those circumstances. Look, this has been, that little bit of the conversation has been great. I now really want to dig in a little bit more about Bill Bates. And of course, I know that we're acquainted, and you know that we're acquainted, but any people listening to this won't be. And I'm going to embarrass you a little bit. I'm sorry, Mr. Bates, but your story of how you became involved, how you started up Boot Brisbane, is quite frankly a pretty inspirational one. And to give the briefest of backgrounds, the way I first heard about you was I heard about this eccentric chap who jumped in his car, using his own time and his own resources, drove around Queensland to rally interest in a new state. So tell me about that journey. Like, we know what inspired you, but like, what happened? Like, there must have been some cool and funny, interesting things that happened in that journey.
It was a misguided adventure, but it was interesting. I mean, I did meet up with some people who heard through the newspaper that I was looking at creating a petition for a separate state and trying to get a little bit of interest. And and the main reason was there were so many people complaining about the situation, you would have thought there was a reasonable amount of support. So, being naive as I was, I decked out a trailer with all signage on it, and I drove to Weipa over the most horrific road I've ever travelled on. It was currently under construction. That was in 2017, and I think there was 26 sections of tar and 26 sections of gravel road. So you went maybe 10 kilometres on one surface, and then another 5 or 2 kilometres on another surface, in great big dust bowls that hadn't been looked after. So that was a fairly novel experience. And I went to Weipa, and the funniest thing about Weipa is they don't really want the road. They want to keep Weipa and the fishing to themselves, because in Weipa, you're either planning to going fishing, organising yourself to go fishing, gone fishing, returning from fishing, or they're planning your next foray. And that's the main focus they seem to be on their life. And it was quite marvellous up there in regards to the facilities they got to launch their boats. They're not short of fantastic. I think you've got three areas you can launch from into the ocean or into the river and go out to. But no, it was a different kettle of fish. But the only thing with Weipa, I think, there's very few locals, and gee whiz, there's a lot of people from interstate in the mining and supporting the mining industry. So it was hard to find a local. But yeah, that was an interesting adventure. And after that, I did a tour from out to Georgetown, out to Croydon, Normanton, over to Mount Isa, then back through Cloncurry, Julia Creek, Richmond, and into Hewington before coming back up the Hand again. all those towns, they were quite interesting and met a lot of people. And talking to people, that they're quite supportive of the idea, but obviously they have no idea how it's happened, or there's no basic education of the advantage of it. So, and while I was in Mount Isa, I met Robbie Catter the first time, and that was probably a year after the KAP had moved a motion in Parliament to try to kick off a separate state sort of commission or inquiry, which was defeated in Parliament. So that was an interesting conversation. And then the final foray was going down the coast from Cairns down to all the way down to Brisbane through Townsville, Mackay, Rockhampton, Gladstone, Bundaberg, and into Brisbane, meeting up with the local newspapers and having little stories put in there, and then back through inland through Monto, over to Emerald and back up to Charters Towers and home. Had quite an interesting journey, a lot of conversations with people on the street, and also a number of newspaper stories in each of those. Unfortunately, the petition really didn't do that well in regards to signatures and that. So we learnt from that little foray that it takes more than one person to make this happen. So that was that, and the redistribution situation was the catalyst to forming Boot Brisbane.
So I got to ask, how did, and we'll make the distinction between the two groups of people, the community generally, and I know that is a hard and broad distinction, and the media class. How were you treated by each of them? Like, were you kind of treated as like this eccentric, have a look at this chap with his tinfoil hat, or was it, were you treated with a degree of respect? And indeed, was the issue taken seriously? I'd be very interested in your take.
I think when you get an opportunity to speak to people about it, it's quickly gets into sort of a realistic conversation, and people are quite happy to listen and get the idea of the problem and what we need to address and the solution. And it's always fine if there's an alternate solution, but I can't really see of one. So there was no problems with speaking to people. They in general didn't dismiss it, like the political class do in general. And the media was very, very, very good. I mean, they gave us every opportunity to speak and get a story across in the paper and that. And no, that was fine. I think the only problem is what we really need from the media class is the editorial type staff is to pick it up as an idea and run with it, so it's out there in editorial basis on a reasonable time scale, and regularly pushing the point where issues come up and they can highlight that a separate state would resolve some of the problems that we face. So I think that's our main hope for the media, is that it moves from the occasional story in regards to what we generate as an interest action, versus them taking it as something they needs to get done for the people of Central North Queensland. Because if I think the motto for the News Limited papers here is "We're for you." Well, maybe if they are for us, well, maybe they should be pushing harder for us to get the representation that we need to make sure our regions develop and grow. And maybe then, if we're developing and growing, their jobs wouldn't be so much on the line, because we've just seen a major cutback in the newsprint industry in Central and North Queensland, and that's basically because there's no growth. There's no growth in these corridors that they service. So without that growth, things retract, and they need to realise that. I'll give you a vast difference. In the case of 1965, when the New England movement was at its height, there was 130 newspapers in a coalition formed by Victor Thompson, who was the editor, I think, for the Armadale's Time at the time, who went on to be a federal politician, I think. But he got 130 local newspapers together to push, for a separate New England state. I mean, he started that probably in the mid-50s, and by the time it got to the actual referendum, they had 130 newspapers on board. All we need is the few that we have got to be on board, and it would make our job much easier.
Indeed. It's not as if the newspapers aren't up for advocating things. Let's be honest. There are so many issues where where it's not just about supporting; it's about active advocacy of issues, and we've seen that on a number of ones. Just to give the briefest of context to our listeners who aren't familiar with what Bill was talking about there in regards to Armidale and the new state, New South Wales. There was, this is not the first new state movement that's existed. There was a push for a new state movement for northern New South Wales, a place that was going to be called, the new state was, one of the propositions was New England. And long story short, giving you the briefest of historical overviews, and Bill is an expert on this, and it's something that he's both interested, he's both interesting and well informed on, so I'll get him to explain a little bit later. But the motion was, the effort was unfortunately defeated by a little bit of, and I don't think it's untoward or uninformed of me to say, by a little bit of a political underhand movement. The party who initially agreed to help make it happen, when it actually came to splitting the state, this is my understanding from what Bill has informed me, included some areas in the new state that they knew did not want to be part of a new state, and that's what fundamentally distorted the voting and eventually defeated the movement. But staying on this excellent trip for now, again, this is something that the New England New State movement is something that we will delve into. Perhaps not even on this particular issue, because I know we've already been going for some time. The time's flying past, if I can make the observation, because I'm finding this very interesting and informative. But tell me a highlight of that magnificent trip. Tell me a low light, and are you in a position to say, like, how many kilometres or miles did you cover? Could you kind of tell us about that?
Well, I think the whole trip was enjoyable in regards to, I hadn't travelled to those places before, so that made it interesting. I don't think there was any lowlights other than driving some particular roads that sort of left you in a bit of shock and awe that these are roads, they're not goat tracks. So I think that's one of the things that sort of came to my attention much foremost. And I mean, we've got so many roads out in the country, in the rural areas, that gee whiz, you think this is a first world country? You're kidding, So I think that's probably the biggest realization. But shock and awe, maybe I was impressed or taken in by the Bauxite Mountains in Weipa, near the loading port. I watched for at least maybe 15-20 minutes these front end loaders get on all sorts of angles, keep piling up the bauxite higher and higher, so the conveyor belts could cut into it and take it across the roadway as you drove into Weipa, across to the port and load directly on the ships. So as you drove into Weipa on the main road, you would go under these conveyor belts where the bauxite was running out to the ships for loading. So that was quite interesting. The other area that I was sort of interested in is Gladstone and the piles of coal waiting to be exported. That was another fantastic sort of vision sort of thing. And you think just those two elements alone, the amount of bauxite we export, the amount of coal we export, just gives you some idea of the wealth Central and North Queensland has that can still be developed for our growth and opportunities in the future. So I suppose they were the most interesting points. The other very interesting thing was the look at the coal trains going out to from Rockhampton out to Emerald along that stretch of road there, and the coal trains probably matched the ore trains of northwest Australia as sort of a sight to behold as it runs out with these millions of dollars worth of export income.
Well, that's great. Well, look, I think we have been going for a little while now, and I do want to leave a number of topics for further interviews. This will not be our first and last interview, assuming your consent, Bill. But look, we'll wrap it up at this stage. So first, I'd like to thank you very much for taking time in your busy schedule to speak to us. I know you're absolutely dedicated about this as your driver around Queensland, and that's a story in itself. I swear to God, there's a documentary in that. That truly was an inspirational story. And there's a lot of other interesting, informative topics that I want to delve into a little bit deeper with you. But I want to leave some material, and I want to leave our listeners hanging. So, look, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to me today. Thank you very much to any of our listeners for coming in. I do recommend that anyone interested in this topic does jump onto the Boot Brisbane website. It's www.bootbrisbane.com. If you just Google Boot Brisbane, it should be the first or occasionally the second. Depending on the search engine, sometimes you get some shoe advertisements coming up first. The first time I looked up it, but generally speaking, you'll get that if you Google Boot Brisbane. And if you want to contact Bill and become more actively involved in creating a new state for North Queensland, that's the website to contact him through. All his contact details are on there. All right, so unless you've got anything else that you particularly want to add, Bill, we'll wrap it up there.
No, Matt, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. It was a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very much. And again, we will do it again very shortly.
Thank you.